following is a project on the Cold War and shows a picture of Mr. Keller and his wife Barbara when they were in Ensenada, Mexico. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union fought together as allies against the Axis powers. However, immediately following World War II, the countries of the world had to choose between the United States and the Soviet Union. This led to the economic, political, military, and social struggle between these two nations for the next 50 years, known as the Cold War. At the Potsdam Conference, the city of Berlin was officially partitioned into 4 separate zones of occupation. Most countries then had to choose between NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which protected the democratic nations of the West, or the Warsaw Pact, which protected the communist regime of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. One of the first major conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union was the Berlin blockade, which led to the Berlin airlift. Soviet forces blocked all transportation routes and communication between Berlin and the democratic nations of the West, so the United States and British forces delivered food, fuel, and other assorted goods by plane for nearly a year to citizens of Soviet-occupied East and West Berlin. The Cold War at this point was in full swing. China at this point was not significantly involved in the Cold War, but that would soon change with the Korean War. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Korean War began when North Korea invaded South Korea. China supplied military weapons and soldiers to the North Korean army, along with assistance from the Soviet Union, while the United Nations, and specifically the United States, provided military and economic aid to South Korea. A policy of containment designed to prevent countries from becoming communist was put in place and was known as the domino theory. A prominent figure of the Cold War during the 1950s was Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. McCarthy's attempt to expose communists in America led to what was known as the Red Scare and included members of the Hollywood elite like Lucille Ball and Charlie Chaplin. In 1960, the presidential race between Republican Richard Nixon and Democrat John Kennedy was a historical event that culminated in the first televised debate between presidential candidates. The televised presidential debate locked up the vote for Kennedy, making him our 35th president. After Kennedy's election, he almost immediately locked horns with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in what was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. During this event, the Soviets sent naval ships to Cuba and threatened to place nuclear weapons in the country. Kennedy responded by warning the Soviets if nuclear weapons were placed in Cuba, the United States would consider this an act of aggression, and the United States would respond with military force if necessary. Eventually, the Soviets backed down and a nuclear war was prevented. A key factor in the Cold War was the space race, where John Kennedy once was quoted by saying, "If not us, who? And if not now, when?" During the space race, the Soviets launched the first capsule into space called Sputnik, and it contained a dog called Laika that orbited the Earth. However, upon re-entry, the dog eventually died. The Soviets were also the first to send a manned capsule into space, where cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin successfully orbited the Earth and returned alive. The United States then countered with the Explorer satellites and eventually sent John Glenn into space, where he orbited the Earth 3 times, putting the United States ahead of the Soviets. Finally, the United States sent a manned mission to the moon, where Apollo 11 landed on the moon with Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and the first man to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong. This event virtually ended the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. When Armstrong landed on the moon, he made the famous quote, "This is one small step for a man, but one giant leap for mankind." On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy visited Dallas, Texas, where he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, and the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, became our 36th president. A decision made early in Johnson's presidency was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, where after North Vietnam had invaded South Vietnam and a North Vietnamese patrol boat had fired on the USS Maddox, Johnson decided to increase the troop involvement in Vietnam by issuing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. A major difference in the Vietnam War was the Soviet Union directly supported North Vietnam in this conflict rather than the Chinese. The Vietnam War actually began in the late 1950s with the rise to power of Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam. As a reflection on the Vietnam War, Ho Chi Minh said, "You can kill 10 of our men for every one we kill of yours, but even at those odds you will lose and we will win." The United States, in an attempt to contain communism, began sending troops to Vietnam. Eventually, the United States sent over 500,000 troops to Vietnam during this conflict, and over 50,000 were killed in action. As the Vietnam War was coming to an end, a disturbing issue was being revealed in United States politics. President Richard Nixon was under fire for what became known as the Watergate scandal, and ultimately he was forced to resign before he would have been impeached and removed from office. This left the United States temporarily vulnerable in the politics of the Cold War. After Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford became president until the next election when Jimmy Carter became president. And during Carter's administration, he signed SALT I and SALT II with the Soviet Union. This was the strategic arms limitation treaties that restrained the arms race and reduced nuclear weapons in both countries. After only one term in office, Carter was defeated by Ronald Reagan, who was known as the Great Communicator, for his ability to take the most difficult situations and explain them in a way that everyone understood, from the common man to high-powered world leaders. Reagan proposed SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative known as Star Wars. Star Wars was designed to develop a sophisticated anti-ballistic missile system to prevent nuclear attacks from other countries and specifically from the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union, and his policies of glasnost and perestroika create a more peaceful environment for the world. These policies and his relationship with Ronald Reagan lead to the destruction of the Berlin Wall, and finally the republics of the Soviet Union claim independence and a complete breakup of communist Soviet Union takes place. The Cold War was a period that included many highs and lows for the two superpowers and the world as a whole. Perhaps the greatest threat to all was the distinct possibility of nuclear annihilation. While that didn't occur, it could have, and some of the research I have done on the turning points I've considered may have made the difference. The Cold War was a conflict of superpowers and their political influence among their people. Depending on what side you were on, you were either anti-communist and supported democratic ideals of freedom, or you were communist and supported government controls of all aspects of your life.